This is going to be the first section of the linguistics lecture. Get this going. There we go. All right, first section of the linguistics lecture. Excuse me. First thing that we want to do is get a clear definition of language. We're going to define language as a system of communication using sounds or gestures that are put together in meaningful ways according to a set of rules. All right, whenever you encounter a complex definition like this, excuse me, what you want to do is break it down into the constituent parts. First of all, it's a system of communication. That's something that's not particularly unique in nature. All animals communicate with each other in one way or another. It's communication through sounds or gestures, so it can be a verbal language or it can be language of hand gestures, like a sign language. It doesn't matter which one. The rules can work the same way. The key is that all these symbols are put together in meaningful ways according to a set of rules, right? And that is really the thing that distinguishes it from other animal communication. So language, a system of communication. First of all, using sounds or gestures, it's the medium, and those sounds or gestures are put together in meaningful ways according to a set of rules. And that's the complex part. Right? That's the part that requires sort of a human brain. Is this distinct from all other animal communications in nature? That's a question we spent a little bit of time talking about in class. I asked people for examples. Whatever people came up with, we talked about and generally ruled things out. Before we get into the exceptions, the things that are close to language in nature, there's nothing exactly the same as human natural language that we find in other species. There are other things that are in the ballpark, right? Or at least rub up against it. They're not that close. Before we talk about that at all, though, we talked about what a repertory system is. Also called a call system. You may see it referred to as either a repertory system or a call system if you happen to read about it. In a repertory system, each repertory system is a set of symbols, and each one of those symbols represents one thing and one thing only. A symbol, simply defined, is a thing that represents another thing. All right, so repertory is a set of symbols. A symbol is a thing that represents another thing. Repertory has a number of symbols in it, and those symbols have to represent one thing only. Each symbol equals one thing, and it has to be concrete and present, meaning it has to be something physical and something that's there at the time. You can't talk about anything in the abstract. You can't talk about something that's going to happen next Thursday. You can't imagine something that doesn't exist. All right, so one symbol equals one thing. That thing has to be concrete and present. Usually these are best measured in dozens. The largest repertory systems usually range for a little over 100 symbols. The largest one that I've ever heard of was somewhat unnatural in its construction. Had to do with these snow monkeys, Japanese macaques. They're a tourist attraction in Japan. We talked a little bit about them in class. There's a hot spring there. It's a cold weather area. There's a hot spring. The monkeys live there, and they play in the hot springs, and it's all good fun for the tourists. There's one right there that stole somebody's cell phone. At one point, those monkeys got overpopulated. They're primates, first of all, so they have more complex brains than a lot of other animals. They're likely to have an extensive repertory system. I think they did in the neighborhood of 150 symbols or so. And they were getting overpopulated. They were going to cull the monkeys, and apparently there was a visitor from Texas at the time who had a watermelon farm, offered to take some of the monkeys off their hands. So they transplanted these monkeys from Hokkaido, the northernmost island in Japan, where they had one repertory system that functioned with 150 or so symbols, to Texas on a watermelon farm, where they ran into a whole bunch of new information in the environment, and so they had to develop even more symbols. So they ended up with something like 300 symbols in their repertory. Now, that's a large repertory system, the largest one that I've ever really heard about. Compare that to human natural language. The average person walking around down the street knows about 10,000 symbols. And by that I mean words, right? More specifically, morphemes, but we'll get into that later. But the average person walking down the street knows about 10,000 words. It doesn't matter what language they are speaking, where they are in the world. That's how human language functions. It requires an enormous number of symbols. So compare that to the 300 as the most expansive repertory system, and is a huge disparity just in vocabulary alone, right? Also, there's a whole set of rules for putting those symbols together that's complicated, and that does not exist in a repertory system. All right, we'll come back and talk a lot more about that later. All right, so what are the exceptions in nature, the things that we find in nature that are sort of similar to human language or have something in common with it? The thing that always comes up in introductory linguistics classes is bees. They don't have brains in the sense that humans have brains, so they certainly don't have any complex brain structures that would support language as we understand it. On the other hand, they do have something called a waggle dance, which is an instinctive behavior. Waggle, W-A-G-G-L-E, waggle dance. And what basically they can do is construct one sentence, only one sentence, but they can construct an infinite number of varieties. Right, so they can basically change certain variables and convey an infinite number of locations of food. So what they do is they go out, they find a food source, they come back to the nest, and they dance in a figure-8 pattern. Right, so and they vary the speed of the vibration of their abdomen, and so they're shaking back and forth, going in a figure-8 pattern. They vary the direction of the figure-8, and so by changing just those variables, they can indicate the distance and flight times from and location of food anywhere basically in the world. A bee goes out and finds food anywhere in the world, can come back, do a certain dance that will direct the other bees to that food source. Right, so that's like being able to say one sentence, this is the location of a food source, and be able to put in variables. Right, so you can already see that it's transcended the repertory system in a certain way. You can talk about something that is not concrete or present at the time. Right, you have to be able to understand food source is something sort of in the abstract, and be able to interpret different directions to the source. Right, so they can basically say one sentence in an infinite number of ways. And again, this is an instinctive behavior. It does not require the sort of complex cognition that we find in association with language. But it is an unusual exception. Great apes, excuse me, there's a supplemental reading that's optional. If you're interested in this, you're welcome to read it. If you do, and the author's name is Hill. If you do read it, you'll find more detail on this. The basic conclusion was that apes have some of the subsystems of language in common with people. They have large, complex brains. They're our closest relatives in nature, the great apes, meaning chimpanzees specifically are the closest ones, but also bonobos, and bonobos would be the second closest, and then there are gorillas and orangutans, which are somewhat farther away. Right, but they're all primates with large, complex brains, not nearly to the point of humans, but still more than other animals. Right, so it's not shocking that they would have some subsystems in common in terms of how we process language. Bottom line is they can learn language to about the level of a 2-year-old child. Right, so if you ever talk to a 2-year-old, you understand the limitations of that. And there was a great deal of optimism early on about how much language they could learn. A lot of people spend a lot of time teaching them sign language, and no matter how much effort you put into it, they learn about to the level of a 2-year-old human. Can't get beyond that. So that probably is the closest thing really in nature as far as we know. Last thing on the list was cetaceans, which is a category that includes dolphins and whales. And I believe people have mostly worked out whale song, but dolphins, I think, are still a little bit of a mystery. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that they can understand abstract thought to a certain extent. We know that they have large brains, which developed around a particular sense. In their case, it was sound. It's the same sort of evolutionary pattern that we see with humans, with our development of brain around sight initially in all primates. And so there was a similar evolutionary process that led to the development of a large brain. We know they're saying a bunch of stuff. We have no idea exactly what it is, right? So, or how complex it is. So I'm sure there are many people who know more about it than I'm conveying here. On the other hand, it's not a resolved issue. So you certainly can't say that they have language, but there are still question marks in that area, and that's why they're added to the list. Right. Beyond that, there's nothing else in nature that approaches human language at all. So none of these are equal to human natural language as far as we know, but there's nothing else that even comes close. And things that came up in class, a lot of times people think of things we have as pets just because we have so much experience with them, like dogs. Basically, we're teaching a dog, when we train a dog, a repertory system. They may be intuitive in a lot of ways. They may understand our behavior and tune into our emotions in ways that we wouldn't even necessarily expect, because they're paying attention to body language and smells and things that we don't even register. But I'm not saying dogs are completely stupid. I'm just saying they don't have a capacity for language. They learn a repertory system: sit, stay, roll over, stuff like that. It doesn't matter what words you use; it matters how they interpret the symbols. Other thing comes up often, and did come up in class, was parrots and minor birds and things like that. And that's because they have a tremendous vocal range and they can mimic sounds. There are a lot of birds that can do that. If you ever had a conversation with a talking parrot, you'll understand that the parrot has basically learned a repertory system, and often in the form of a script, because people will teach them these things. Like, hello, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? And then once you get beyond the bounds of the script, they don't know what to say, so they just start repeating stuff that they know and hope they hit the right thing. That's usually how it works with parrots. Not to say the parrots are stupid, it's just they don't have a capacity for language either. Right? They use repertory systems. And have a wide vocal range, so they can pronounce things that sound like English, for example, but it doesn't mean they understand a word of it. All right. Moving on, linguistics. We use that term a lot. We call that one of the four subfields of anthropology, anthropological linguistics. Here we're referring to the scientific study of all aspects of language. And here we're going to point out after this that there were two paths to the development of linguistics as we understand it today. And one was through the humanities, one was through the social sciences. So for a basic definition of linguistics, we want scientific study of all aspects of language. The graphic I've got up here is just a map of language families around the world. And those are languages that are grouped together into families based on similarities and either understood connections, from studying recent languages that people have record of, and some reconstruction as well in terms of figuring out which languages belong to which groups. They look at the past and they theorize languages that it must have existed in the past from which current languages evolved. And those theorized languages are called proto-languages, by the way. Proto-language. So the proto-linguistic group that English belongs to is Proto-Indo-European. That's a language that must have existed in the past in some form. We know what things it must have had in common. There was a group of speakers that was speaking this language, but we don't know exactly what it was like. All right, so it's a reconstructed language. Nobody's spoken within living memory or living record, right? So nobody even was alive 2,000 years ago that wrote about it. It was before that time even, but it was reconstructed theoretically. That's a proto-language. All right. So often at the root of each one of these groups, there'll be a proto-language that's been reconstructed. All right. In any case, there are a lot of language families and a lot of languages in the world, obviously. All right. We said that linguistics came from basically two different tracks in academic study overall, and they reflect two different approaches as well. One is prescriptive linguistics, the other is descriptive linguistics. The first path is the humanities path, and we started off the class talking about social science, defining social science, systematic study of human behavior, which draws on the methodology of natural sciences, and contrasting that with the humanities, which are things like includes history and literature and things like that. So those may be systematic studies of human behavior as well, but they don't rely on the natural sciences at all. They may not even be that systematic. Right? If you think about how a novel is written, it's arguable whether it's exactly a systematic study of anything. Doesn't mean it doesn't engage human behavior in an interesting way, though. All right. In that humanities tradition, linguistics was not called linguistics initially. It started before what we understand as social science-based linguistics today, and it was called philology, 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 study of words. And again, that came out of the humanities tradition. It was a prescriptive tradition of linguistics. Prescriptive linguists are interested in how people should talk. That is, they assume that there is a correct way of speaking and an incorrect way. And any way that's not the correct way is the incorrect way. Right? This is an approach that you've encountered if you ever took an English grammar class, or if you ever learned a foreign language at a college or a high school. You would have encountered a prescriptive approach to linguistics. Is the right way of speaking, and we want to make sure we understand all the correct rules. So in the philological tradition, that was very much an assumption that there are correct ways and there are incorrect ways. In the social science tradition, it emerged from a more descriptive understanding of linguistics. Descriptive linguists are interested in how people do talk, not just how they should talk. So they don't assume that there is a perfect form of a language and anything else is deviation. They understand that language is being dynamic and changing, and it's a relativist approach. We already understood cultural relativism earlier in the course as the idea that all cultures are equal and equally adaptive. Well, a relativist approach to language would assume that all these different variants of language are equal to each other. Right? All languages are equal and equally functional. So the examples that I've got for the prescriptive approach, I just put the English grammar for dummies up there because I could have used a million textbooks. Any of them would have worked. I just threw that up there as an example. But that is prescriptive. This is how you speak and use proper English grammar, and that's it, period. Example I put up for descriptive linguistics, it actually comes out of anthropology, and you'll notice that Franz Boas, this is 2 books in one. Franz Boas has written one of the books, first one, Handbook of American Indian Languages. Remember, he was doing salvage ethnography, came to the United States from Central Europe in around 1900, a little bit before that, I think, and he was looking westward to the disappearance of native groups. He was trying to preserve those disappearing cultures. Now, whether he could preserve the people is another matter, but the cultures he thought could be preserved. And that's why he came up with the 4 fields. If you recall, we talked about this much earlier in the course. All right, so part of that, one of the 4 fields is linguistics. So one of the things he wanted to preserve was languages. So it's not unusual that he would write a book called Handbook of American Indian Languages. He, along with a lot of his students, went out and tried to document and preserve these languages, and they were doing it from a descriptive point of view. They didn't necessarily think that, well, that is a correct Native American language. No, they didn't worry about that. They just went and noted how they spoke these languages and how they're related to each other, and assumed them all to be equal and functional. Below that, you see Indian linguistic families of North America. American North of Mexico, sorry. That was by John Wesley Powell, who was another important early figure in American anthropology. He predated Boas, was working out west, did a fair amount of archaeology, as I recall. Excuse me, in any case, was interested in some of the same things. Boas wasn't the first person to ever take sort of this 4-field approach. He just kind of solidified it in a way that was made sense to a lot of people. Right, so those are the 2 examples that I put forward for descriptive linguistics. Now, there was a convergence of these 2 approaches over time. Right, so through the 19th century, certainly into the 20th century, they started to converge, come together into really one discipline. Now, it still is divided in certain ways because there are people who became linguists strictly through English and comparative lit programs at various universities and never went to an anthropology class in their life. And there are people who learned linguistics entirely through anthropology, also from linguistics departments, which tend to be social science based. Right, there are, you can get a PhD in linguistics. There are large universities with linguistics departments. Right, so I've run across linguists who came from both of these traditions. I said there's a convergence because they both kind of understand things the same way at this point. No matter which path they happen to take. If you go back 100 years, that wasn't the case. There was people with very different ideas about how language functioned. All right, but today, again, there's been a convergence. They're pretty much all the same thing. If you're doing linguistics, you're doing linguistics. You're drawing from the same body of theory. All right, I'm going to break that one there, and then we're going to pick up with the elements of structural linguistics. This is from the descriptive approach, obviously, but it's about structural linguistics. We've got 4 subfields. We're going to break here. I'll pick up and do that as a separate section. Break out of that. Stop there.